50 years ago, a group of self-described revolutionaries did something that shocked the world. In just 2 years, they declared war on America, assassinated a beloved school superintendent, robbed several banks, bombed several police cars, murdered an innocent bystander, kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst, and convinced her to join their cause before most of the group burned to death in a fiery shootout in Los Angeles right on live television. This webcast is about everything that made that story possible, and almost none of it is what I expected to find when I started looking. I came to this project with a set of beliefs about the Symbionese Liberation Army and the era that produced them. I had to dismantle most of those beliefs before I could tell this story honestly. This is the story of who the SLA really were, what they actually believed, and what it tells us about a nation that is still grappling with the same failures that produced them. This is House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution.
Most people who know anything about this case know this image before they know anything else. The beret, the rifle, or the bank security camera still shots taken on April 15, 1974 in the Sunset District branch of the Hibernia Bank in San Francisco. A young woman in a bad wig, a dark coat, holding an assault rifle. Both of those images are well over 50 years old, and they have not faded in our collective consciousness. They still generate the same argument they generated the week they were published. The argument about who she was in that moment, what she wanted, what had been done to her, what she had chosen. Most people know the name Tanya as much as they know the name Patricia. Most people see the symbol before they know the person. This episode is about the person, because the human being who was dragged out of a Berkeley apartment on the night of February 4th, 1974, in her robe, without shoes, bound and blindfolded, and pushed into the trunk of a stolen car, had a history before that night, had a family she was complicated about, and a fiancé she was building a life with, and a curriculum she was taking, and a future she was imagining. She had 19 years of ordinary human experience that the symbol has almost entirely obscured. You cannot understand what was done to Patricia Hearst without understanding who Patricia Hearst was before it was done to her. And who she was is considerably more complicated and more sympathetic than the caricature that the media coverage and the trial and the 50 years of cultural shorthand have produced. She was not the self-indulgent heiress that SLA presumed, the pampered daughter of privilege who had no relationship to the world the organization claimed to be fighting for. She was a 19-year-old woman living in an apartment with her older fiancé. She was enrolled at UC Berkeley, taking art history classes, genuinely left-leaning in her politics, shaped by the periphery of the same atmosphere that had shaped the people who were about to kidnap her. She was not ideologically distant from the world she was forced into. She was, in ways that the closed rooms framework could not accommodate and did not try to, already sympathetic to parts of the argument the manifesto was making. They did not kidnap an enemy. They kidnapped someone who might, in another version of events, have found them relatable. You must first understand what the name Hearst meant in America in 1974. Not what it means now, softened by time, reduced to a footnote in media history, a famous film from 8.5 decades ago. the tourist attraction at San Simeon, and the newspaper fortune that built it all largely gone. You have to know what it meant then, the weight of it, the history attached to it, because the SLA did not pick a name out of a directory of wealthy California families. They picked a name that carried the entire history of everything they were fighting against. Patricia's grandfather, William Randolph Hearst, was born in 1863, the only child of a California mining magnate who had turned his fortune into a political career and, along the way, acquired a newspaper. What William Randolph did with that newspaper, and then with the dozens of newspapers, magazines, wire services, and radio stations he added to it over the following half-century, was something that American journalism had not seen before and has not seen since. At the height of his power in the 1930s, Hearst controlled the largest media empire in the world. His papers reached millions of readers daily across every major American city. His editors knew what he wanted without being told. His reporters understood that their job was not simply to cover the news, but to present it in ways that served his purposes, his politics, and his personality. The purposes, politics, and personality of William Randolph Hearst were, to put it gently, complicated. The term yellow journalism was invented to describe what the Hearst papers did in the 1890s. The sensationalism, the manufactured outrage, the willingness to distort or fabricate events in the service of a narrative that would sell papers and advance political agendas. The Spanish-American War of 1898 is the example most often cited, and the citation is warranted. Hearst's papers, particularly the New York Journal, covered the conflict in Cuba with a ferocity and a disregard for factual accuracy that historians have long credited with helping to manufacture public support for a war that the American government had been reluctant to enter. Whether or not Hearst actually sent the telegram that history attributes to him, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," the sentiment it expressed was not inaccurate. This was the foundational Hearst legacy, the use of media power to shape public reality in service of private interests. Not journalism in any traditional sense, but something more ambitious and more dangerous. The construction of a version of events that served the constructor's purposes, delivered at a scale that made it difficult for competing versions to gain traction. The Hearst papers did not merely cover American political life. They participated in it, shaped it, and on more than one occasion appeared to drive it. Hearst's politics shifted across his long life in ways that defy simple categorization. He supported labor unions early and abandoned them later. He opposed American involvement in the First World War and supported it in the Second. He was an isolationist, a jingoist, a progressive, and a red baiter at different points in his career, sometimes within the same decade. What remained consistent was not the ideology, but the instrument, the media empire as an extension of his personal will, the papers as a tool for whatever Hearst needed them to be in any given moment. The thing that made him a figure of lasting controversy, and that made his name in 1974 still carry a charge in Bay Area radical circles, was his relationship to power. Hearst had never used his papers to challenge the existing distribution of wealth and power in America in any fundamental way. He had used them to shape that distribution in ways that served his interests and the interests of the class he represented. When he attacked corrupt politicians, it was typically politicians who stood in his way. When he championed the common man, it was in service of a political agenda that had little to do with the common man's actual interests. The Hearst papers were, in the ideological language of the SLA's manifesto, instruments of the fascist capitalist class, not incidentally or occasionally, but structurally and deliberately. Filmmaker Orson Welles had understood this. Citizen Kane, released in 1941 over Hearst's strenuous objections, had taken the Hearst story and made it into something that went beyond biography. A portrait of the specific corruption that follows from the accumulation of unchecked power, the emptiness at the center of a life organized around the acquisition and exercise of influence. Hearst tried to suppress the film. He failed. The film survived him by decades and has outlasted the empire that gave it its subject. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951, 3 years before his granddaughter Patricia was born. What he left behind was not simply a fortune, but a structure, a family relationship to wealth and influence and public life that his descendants would navigate in ways he had not entirely anticipated. Randy Hearst, Randolph Apperson Hearst, Patricia's father, was not his father. The framework that had designated the Hearst name as a symbol of corporate fascism had been built on the legacy of William Randolph, and it could not accommodate the reality of the man who was actually Patricia's father and the chairman of his father's media empire beginning in 1973. Randy Hearst was, by the accounts of people who knew him well, a genuinely decent man whose politics were considerably more liberal than the family name suggested. He was not the robber baron the manifesto would decree. He was a newspaper executive who had inherited a position in a media organization, who had complicated feelings about that inheritance, and who would demonstrate, in the weeks following his daughter's kidnapping, a quality of genuine humanity that the SLA had not predicted and could not categorize. He would also demonstrate something that surprised many observers: a willingness to engage seriously with the political demands of the people who had taken his daughter, not because he agreed with them, but because his daughter's life was at stake. The People in Need program, the food distribution initiative that the SLA demanded as the price of his daughter's safety, would be funded and organized by Randy Hearst at significant personal cost, and its execution would reveal something both about the limits of the SLA's theory of political action and about the genuine complexity of the man the theory had designated as the enemy. Patricia grew up in the rarefied world that her family name created. Private schools and family properties and the social texture of inherited California wealth in the post-war decades. She was raised behind the kind of walls that old California money built around itself. She had attended the schools that old California money attended. She had moved through the world with the slow emerging consciousness of someone who had been given everything and was, by early 1974, in the process of building something for herself that was distinctly her own. The distance she had put between herself and the Hearst world, the Berkeley apartment, the relationship with her fiancé that her family found puzzling if not troubling, the independence she was constructing from the inheritance she had been born into was real. She was not the caricature of privilege that the SLA's communiques would describe. She was a 19-year-old woman trying to become a person rather than a name. The name, however, was the target, not Patricia, not the human being who had been building a life in Berkeley. The name. The person who carried that name was, to the SLA's planning, almost incidental. She was about to become the most consequential incidental in American criminal history. The list of potential kidnapping targets that police found in the ruins of the Sutherland courthouse was long, nearly 24 names: corporate executives, banking figures, local representatives of the institutional structures the SLA had designated as the enemy. Any of them, in the organization's ideological framework, would have been a legitimate target. Any of them would have generated a certain amount of attention, a bank executive taken from his car, a corporate officer grabbed from a parking garage. The FBI would have investigated. The local press would have covered it. There would have been a communique or two, a negotiation of some kind, and then a resolution or a failure, and then the story would have been over. The SLA did not want a story that would be over. They wanted something that would be impossible to look away from, something that would force every newspaper and television station in the country to engage with the organization's demands, its ideology, its diagnosis of American society for weeks or months rather than days. Something that would produce the kind of sustained, unavoidable front page attention that no other action available to this group of people could possibly generate. They had read their Tupamaros carefully. They understood the theory. The value of a revolutionary kidnapping was not primarily the ransom, it was the duration, the sustained spectacle of negotiation, of demands being issued and responded to and issued again, of a powerful family being forced to engage publicly with the terms a revolutionary organization had set. This was what the Tupamaro model had demonstrated and what the SLA was reaching for. Not a transaction, a performance, a public theater of power and powerlessness in which, for perhaps the first time in the SLA's brief and catastrophic history, the organization would hold the advantage. The name Hearst made all of that possible in a way that no other name on the list could. William Randolph Hearst had built the largest private media empire in the world on a documented willingness to use that empire as an instrument of political and economic power. The yellow journalism, the manufactured outrage, the role that Hearst papers had played in building public support for wars, in attacking political enemies, in constructing versions of reality that served the tycoon's interests and the interests of the class he represented. This was not radical interpretation. This was documented history, available to anyone who looked. The research files that Zoya had assembled from the Berkeley Public Library, the same files that had produced the incoherent indictment of Marcus Foster, contained a much stronger case against the Hearst legacy than they had ever contained against Oakland's school superintendent. The Hearst papers had done, across a century of American media history, many of the things the SLA's manifesto accused the fascist capitalist class of doing. They had manufactured consent. They had served power. They had shaped public reality in ways that benefited the wealthy and obscured the conditions of the poor. In the SLA's ideology, the Hearst name was not a random choice. It was almost a theoretically perfect choice. A family whose fortune had been built on the instrument of public manipulation that the manifesto designated as one of the primary tools of the fascist state would now be asked to use that fortune to feed the people it had spent a century helping to exploit. The irony was intentional. The SLA understood irony, even when it could not always translate that understanding into effective political action. And there was a deeper irony still. The SLA was not simply targeting the Hearst legacy. It was proposing to use the Hearst legacy against itself. Think about what the organization was actually planning. They would take a Hearst and hold her. They would issue demands that would force the Hearst family, and through the Hearst family, the media apparatus that the family name represented, to cover the SLA story on the SLA's terms for as long as the organization chose to maintain the situation. Every communique would be read on the radio and printed in the papers. Every demand would be reported and analyzed and debated. The ideology that had been dismissed and condemned after the Foster assassination would have a daily platform, week after week, generated by the very media empire whose legacy the ideology was attacking. The Hearst papers would have to cover the kidnapping of a Hearst. The organization that had declared war on the fascist media was about to become the biggest story in America, carried to the public by the infrastructure of the institution it was attacking. There was, in the abstract, something almost elegant about this, a judo move of sorts, using the weight of the enemy's own power against it. That it would not work the way the theory suggested does not make the theory incoherent. The SLA's understanding of media mechanics was, in some respects, more sophisticated than their understanding of politics. They were correct that the Hearst name would generate coverage that nothing else could. They were correct that the combination of inherited wealth, radical politics, and an imperiled young woman would be impossible for the American press to look away from. They were correct that the sustained attention of the national media would give the organization a platform it could never have built through any other means available to it. What they had not fully accounted for was what the media would do with that platform. The diagnosis would not be the story. The spectacle would be the story, as it had always been, as it always is. The specific demands the SLA intended to make were, in their way, the most revealing thing about the organization's self-understanding at this point in its history. The primary demand was the release of Russell Little and Joe Ramiro from custody. This was straightforward. The organization wanted its people back, and a Hearst was the leverage it believed could compel the state to provide them. Whether this was a realistic expectation, given California's legal and political realities in 1974, is a different question, and one the SLA had not thought through with any rigor. The secondary demand was something else entirely, something that had no precedent in the history of revolutionary kidnapping in this country, and that revealed, more clearly than anything else in the organization's playbook, the combination of genuine ideological commitment and profound disconnection from reality that had defined the SLA from its first day in that Oakland apartment. The SLA intended to demand that the Hearst family fund a massive food distribution program for the poor of California. Millions of dollars in free food distributed to the neediest communities in the state. The Symbionese Federation's stated commitment to feeding the people, the same commitment that had inspired the Black Panthers' breakfast programs, the same basic human need that Marcus Foster had been trying to address through the Oakland school system's after-school programs, would be operationalized as a ransom demand directed at one of California's wealthiest families. The symbolism was almost too perfect to have been designed. The Hearst fortune, built on a century of media power that had served the interests of the wealthy, would be turned to the direct and immediate benefit of the people that wealth had helped to exploit. A family that had built its position on the manufacture of public consent would be forced, publicly and on terms it did not control, to demonstrate that its money could do something other than accumulate. This is what the SLA believed the kidnapping would accomplish. And Randy Hearst, the man who was not his father, the newspaper executive who was considerably more complicated than the organization's framework had prepared them for, would in fact organize and fund a food distribution program. The People in Need initiative would be funded with Hearst money, and its execution would teach the SLA and the watching country something that the ideology had consistently refused to acknowledge: that the gap between the theory of what the people needed and the reality of what the people wanted was not always bridgeable by good intentions and sufficient funding. The program would be real, and it would be chaotic, and it would be genuine, and it would fail in the exact ways that programs always fail when they are designed by people who have not consulted the communities they are designed to serve. But Randy Hearst would try, and in trying, he would be changed by the experience in ways that the SLA had not predicted. The man who had been designated in the communiques and the manifesto and the closed rooms framework as a representative of the fascist capitalist class would turn out to be a human being capable of genuine response to genuine crisis. He would learn things in the weeks and months that followed February 4th that he had not known before, about his daughter, about the world she had been living in, about what the country looked like from the other side of the walls that inherited wealth builds around itself. The kidnapping of Patricia Hearst was the most strategically coherent thing the Symbionese Liberation Army ever did. It was coherent in a way that had almost nothing to do with revolution and almost everything to do with spectacle. The vanguard theory, reduced to its most essential form, not organizing, not building, not consulting the people about what they needed, performing, and hoping the performance, this time, would finally inspire the uprising that the theory had always promised. But do not forget, the list of kidnapping targets was already made before Bo and Osceola were arrested. Patty Hearst's kidnapping was always an evolving and desperate attempt to launch the Symbionese Liberation Army into a leadership position among the radical left. If Marcus Foster's assassination didn't give them street cred and every left-leaning ally denounced them, then surely taking a daughter of privilege and holding her, for whatever reason they invented each week, would do the trick. Patricia Campbell Hearst was born on February 20th, 1954, the third of 5 daughters born to Randolph Apperson Hearst and Catherine Campbell Hearst. She came into the world with a name that meant something, that had meant something for longer than her parents or grandparents had been alive, that would continue to mean something long after she had no say in the matter. The weight of that name was the first and most constant fact of her existence, and everything she did in the 19 years before February 4th, 1974, can be understood at least in part as her negotiation with it. She grew up at the family estate in Hillsborough, the gated community south of San Francisco, where the Hearst family had settled, a world of private schools and large properties and the social texture of inherited California wealth that organized itself carefully and completely around its own continuity. It was a comfortable world, a privileged world, and it was also a world with clear expectations about what the people born into it were supposed to become. Patricia was not, from an early age, entirely comfortable with those expectations. Her father, Randolph Apperson Hearst, Randy to everyone who knew him, was a tall, genial man whose personal warmth was genuine and whose liberalism sat somewhat incongruously with his position as the publisher of the San Francisco Examiner. He was the parent Patricia felt closest to, the one whose presence in her childhood was consistent and affectionate, the one who had invited her at 12 to learn to shoot a rifle and hunt ducks. Catherine Campbell had grown up in Atlanta, Georgia, the daughter of a Southern family with its own sense of propriety and its own expectations about what women were supposed to become. She was educated, socially assured, and possessed of a quality of self-possession that never entirely softened into warmth. She met Randy Hearst through the social infrastructure of wealth and family connection that arranged such things, and married into a name and a legacy that required, among other things, a certain kind of wife. Catherine became that wife with apparent conviction and apparent ease. She sat on the Board of Regents at the University of California. She was active in civic and philanthropic circles across the Bay Area. She chaired committees and attended events and navigated the social demands of the Hearst name with the fluency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this role her entire life. What her relationship with her daughters actually looked like from inside is harder to document. What the people who knew the family described is a mother whose love was real, but whose expression of it ran through expectation rather than ease. a woman who had organized her own life around a precise set of values and who communicated those values to her children with authority. The 5 Hearst daughters were raised in a household that had structure and comfort, a home where appearances were maintained with care, where the right schools and the right friends and the right comportment were not simply desirable but assumed. Catherine was the parent who consistently enforced those assumptions. Patricia was the daughter who most visibly chafed against that comportment. Not through open rebellion, she was not by temperament a confrontational child, but through a persistent, low-level resistance to the rigid shape her mother's world wanted her to take. She was restless inside the structure. She found the convent school atmosphere stifling. She was drawn from an early age toward a version of herself that had more room in it than the Hearst family's expectations allowed. Whether Catherine fully understood this about her 3rd daughter, or whether she interpreted Patricia's restlessness as a phase to be waited out, is unclear. What is clear is that the relationship between Catherine Hearst and Patricia was one of genuine love and genuine distance. 2 women who cared about each other and who saw the world through frameworks different enough that the caring did not always translate into understanding. Patricia was educated at Catholic institutions primarily, where discipline and decorum were the organizing values and were the gap between the structured environment of the classroom and the turbulence of the world outside was managed by simply not acknowledging the turbulence. She attended Menlo Oaks, then the convent of the Sacred Heart in Menlo Park, schools that were preparing their students for a life that Patricia was already beginning to feel was not quite the one she was going to be living. She was not a natural fit for the convent school environment. The discipline that the institution imposed sat uneasily on a young woman who had from an early age a quality of independence. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of self-possession that required more space than the structured world of Sacred Heart was designed to provide. She was not unhappy there in any dramatic sense. She simply did not thrive. At 12, her father invited her to learn to shoot. She took to it. This is a small detail, but it carries weight. It suggests something about the relationship between Patricia and Randy Hearst, which was genuine and warm and complicated in the way of father-daughter relationships, where the father is also the custodian of a legacy the daughter is expected to carry. Randy Hearst was not a cold or distant parent. He was, by the accounts of people who knew the family, genuinely invested in his daughters, genuinely present in their lives, and genuinely unable to fully see the ways in which the world he had given them was also a world that constrained them. Patricia transferred eventually to Crystal Springs School for Girls in Hillsborough, another private institution, but one with a somewhat different atmosphere than the convent school. It was here that she encountered Stephen Weed. He was 23, a Princeton graduate and former captain of the track team, teaching math to the school's 7th and 8th graders, a grade well below the one Patricia was actually in. The 2 of them had no obvious path to meeting through the classroom at all. So she found another one. Weed led a guitar workshop on campus, and Patricia spent 6 months maneuvering her way into it. Once she was there, she took the next step herself, calling him at home one evening under the pretext of needing help with a geometry problem. The visits that followed went to his house a few afternoons a week, and the relationship that developed there became, among other things, Patricia's first sexual experience. Neither of them told the school. Neither of them told her parents. Word got out eventually, the way it tends to. An extra class let her graduate early, and not long after, she moved into Weed's home. She was 18, the same age her mother had married, the same age her older sister Gina had married. And marriage was already the plan the 2 of them were building toward. Weed had actually given Patricia's sister Vicky a failing grade in his math class despite her borderline performance, a detail that suggested either unusual academic integrity or an unusually complicated relationship to the family he was becoming entangled with. When the Hearsts learned of the relationship, their response was tolerant, if not enthusiastic. The floppy mustache Weed wore was a particular point of contention for Randy and Catherine. Their first gift to him was a razor. Patricia first attended Menlo College, but when Stephen won a fellowship and teaching grant at UC Berkeley, she too transferred there, and the couple rented an apartment on Benvenue Avenue in the flatlands not far from the university. Berkeley was not Hillsborough or Menlo Park. Berkeley in the early 1970s was the most politically charged city in America, a place where ideas had consequences and where the gap between American rhetoric and American reality was a subject of daily, serious, often furious conversation. Patricia was not apolitical. She was not the ideologically detached heiress of the caricature that would later be constructed around her. She was a young woman who paid attention, who had opinions, who was absorbing the moral atmosphere of a city that took the world's injustices personally. Her politics were genuinely left-leaning. She cared about the war, about racial justice, about the conditions of the poor, the same conditions that the SLA claimed to be fighting for, expressed in the same Berkeley atmosphere that had shaped the people who were going to kidnap her. She was not, by any honest assessment, an ideological enemy of the organization that was watching her apartment and noting her schedule. She was closer to an ally than an enemy, which is the devastating irony at the heart of everything that followed. But she admittedly deferred to Stephen when it came to political consensus and the talk around their future. He was more interested in abstract philosophy, Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard, than protests. The relationship between Patricia and Stephen Weed was not simple. Weed was the dominant figure in the domestic arrangement, more certain of his opinions, more comfortable in the role of the person who set the terms. There are accounts of arguments that escalated, signs of the power differential between a man in his 20s and a young woman not yet out of her teens. One story demonstrates that differential better than any. An argument between them in which Weed picked Patricia up and deposited her outside their front door, leaving her locked outside until he decided she had sufficiently cooled down to be readmitted to their own home. Patty had a full load of classes at Berkeley. She enjoyed it. And then Stephen proposed and she accepted. The wedding was tentatively set for June 29, 1974. In December of 1973, Randy Hearst summoned a photographer from the Examiner to the family estate at Hillsborough. Patricia and Stephen posed in front of the fireplace. Patricia smiling, Stephen in his only blazer with a fresh haircut that suggested effort, if not ease. The story ran in the Examiner and also in the rival San Francisco Chronicle because the Hearsts were always news in California. Patricia Hearst to marry. The photograph went out across the state. Patricia smiling in her parents' home, engaged to a man her family found puzzling but acceptable. The future arranged in the hopeful way that really only happens when you are 19, and the worst problem you have is your fiance's mustache. This is who Patricia Campbell Hearst was, not a symbol. A 19-year-old taking art history classes at Berkeley, planning a summer wedding, arguing with her fiance, making up over tuna sandwiches and episodes of Mission Impossible, building distance from the world she had been born into and toward something that was more genuinely her own. A young woman whose politics were sympathetic to the causes of the people who were watching her building from across the street. She did not know they were surveilling her. She did not know their names. She did not know that in a house in Daly City, a closet had been modified so that its door could not be opened from the inside. But she later acknowledged that something felt wrong at the start of February 1974, like something heavy was about to happen. The name Patricia Campbell Hearst had been on the list found at Sutherland Court. It was the engagement announcement that brought her to the attention of the SLA. Written in the same notebooks, among the same pages of corporate executives and banking figures and potential targets, her name had sat in police custody since January 10th without generating the alert that might have changed what happened on February 4th. The police had the list. They did not warn her. They did not contact her family or notify her school. The operational security failure was complete and consequential and would never be adequately explained. The planning that followed Osceola and Bowe's arrest was unusually disciplined. The Foster assassination had been carefully prepared in its ideology and catastrophically careless in its operational security. Evidence left behind, witnesses, the getaway that careened around the city. The arrests in Concord had taught the remaining members something, not about the human cost of what they were doing, about the importance of not leaving evidence behind. A lesson they botched, unbeknownst to them, when Sutherland Drive failed to burn with the bulk of their evidence left to be pilfered by law enforcement and press, when the fire Faiza set was starved of oxygen. The kidnapping of Patricia Hearst was planned with detail and a care that the organization had not previously demonstrated. The target had been selected from the list. The criteria had been applied: maximum publicity, maximum leverage, maximum symbolic value. And now a fourth criteria that the Foster assassination had not required: the target had to be someone whose disappearance would compel the state to negotiate rather than simply investigate. A Hearst was all of those things simultaneously. The surveillance began. The SLA members who conducted the reconnaissance of Benvenue Avenue learned from their previous failures. They watched the apartment. They studied the building, a 4-unit complex with no security infrastructure, no doorman, no mechanism that would prevent someone from walking up to the door of apartment 4 and knocking. They observed the patterns of the people who lived there. They noted that Patricia and Stephen Weed seldom went out in the evenings, particularly early in the week. They noted the low traffic patterns on Benvenue Avenue. They noted the layout of the building, the approach to the door, the geography of a location that could be reached, entered, and exited with the right planning and the right timing. What they knew about Patricia Hearst's daily life by the time they were done with their reconnaissance was considerable. They knew her routine. They knew her schedule. They knew that the apartment's lack of security meant that the approach to the door was the most vulnerable moment of the operation. After that, inside a building with no one to call and no one to intervene, the action would depend primarily on speed and the advantage that armed people have over unarmed ones.
They knew she would be there on the night they chose.
The weapons brought to Benvenue Avenue on the night of February 4th were chosen with the same operational care as everything else about the planning. This was not the improvised armament of people acting on impulse. It was the deliberate selection of tools for a specific task. Enough firepower to control the situation, enough restraint to avoid the kind of violence that would make the kidnapping into a murder. The SLA wanted Patricia Hearst alive. She was the leverage. Dead, she was nothing. Alive, she was the most powerful negotiating instrument the organization had ever possessed. The distinction mattered. The organization had demonstrated with Foster that it was capable of killing. It needed to demonstrate now that it was capable of something more controlled than killing, capable of the sustained, disciplined, operationally complex act of holding a human being in captivity while conducting a negotiation with her family and the state simultaneously. The Tupamaro model required this. The People's Jail required prisoners who were alive and functional and coherent enough to participate in the political theater the kidnapping was designed to create. Back at Northridge Drive, a closet in the master bedroom had been prepared. The modification to the door hardware was simple. The knobs had been changed so that the door could not be opened from the inside. A person placed in that closet could not let themselves out, could not choose to leave, could only wait for the door to be opened by someone on the other side. It was not a large closet. It was not a comfortable space. It was dark and it was small, a space that could contain a person, a space that a person could not escape, a space where voices from outside would be audible, but the outside would be completely inaccessible. This was the people's jail. This was where the theory of the Tupamaro kidnapping, studied in the well-thumbed interview transcripts, translated into physical reality. A closet in a rented house in Daly City with a bolt on the outside of the door. It was a Monday evening, February 4th, 1974. Patricia and Stephen were home. She was in her robe. They had eaten dinner and settled in for the night, each with their own homework, a paper she was working on, a class he was preparing for, the television playing in the background. The street outside was quiet. There was nothing about the evening that seemed out of place. At 9:17 p.m., the doorbell rang. As Patty walked from the couch to the kitchen, she noticed the bulky shadow of a human figure and said aloud, "That's weird," as Stephen went to the door. Patty heard a woman's voice, agitated, something about a car accident, and could she come in and use their phone? Patty immediately felt alarmed, not threatened. She thought the woman might have hit her own MG parked down in the garage below. And then there was the sound of a scuffle. Two men came through the door, pushing past Stephen. One man was black, thin, and the other was white, short and stocky. The men went after Stephen. The black man swung a rifle and hit Weed with it. The blow landed on his head. He went down. Before he could do anything from the floor, he was hit again, and then again. The blows, not frenzied but deliberate, each one purposeful. He was bound, hands pulled behind his back, feet secured, and left on the floor of his own apartment. The woman, a white woman with frizzy blonde hair, came after Patty into the kitchen, pointing an automatic pistol right in her face. "Be quiet and nobody'll get hurt." The white man came and pushed Patty to the floor. She looked up and he said, "Don't look at me." The girl disappeared as the man tied Patty's hands behind her back. A gag was put into her mouth and tied. A blindfold was wrapped around her eyes. Then she heard Stephen in the living room suddenly shrieking in pain. He had managed to get up and was thrashing around the apartment trying to get out. They went after him again. She was in her robe and underpants. She had nothing on her feet. She was lying on her kitchen floor, listening to her fiancé being beaten feet away, and there were 3 strangers in her apartment with guns. She spit out the gag and began screaming. Someone dragged her up and off the floor, outside onto the porch. She heard a neighbor open a door and say, "Oh my God," and then the door slammed shut. And suddenly, from somewhere, she heard the sound of automatic weapon fire. Patty was still screaming. She heard glass shattering, and then suddenly felt a blast of pain, struck hard on her left cheek with the butt of a rifle. She nearly lost consciousness. The blindfold slipped a little, and she could see the concrete stairs of the apartment building below her. Then someone grabbed her and dragged her down the steps, down to the carport below. She heard the sound of a motor running, a car right in front of her. Patty started to back away in her bare feet, and the black man shouted, "Oh, no, you don't." And she was scooped up again and tossed into the trunk of the waiting vehicle. A blanket was thrown over her head, and everything went dark. There was the sound again of gunfire as the trunk was slammed closed, and then the sound of the doors closing behind the others inside. There had been 2 cars waiting while they abducted Patty. both parked on Benvenue Avenue, a 1964 Chevrolet and a station wagon. Both of them stolen, both of them obtained the same way. The SLA had carjacked them from drivers who had been forced out at gunpoint on separate occasions and told not to call the police. The cars had been sitting on this street, waiting for this moment. In the darkness, Patricia Hearst was lying in the trunk of the Chevrolet, in her robe and underpants, with nothing on her feet, and her hands bound, and the cold of the metal around her, and the sound of her own breathing. A voice came through the car, close enough to be heard, clear enough to be understood. "Shut your mouth," it said, "or I'm going to blow your motherfucking head off." She went still. The engine started. The car began to move. She could feel every movement, every turn, every acceleration, every stop. The metal of the trunk was cold, and the darkness was complete, and the robe she was wearing was not enough for the temperature, and there was nothing to hold on to, and nothing to brace against. She had no sense of direction. She could not see anything. She could not hear anything clearly except the engine and the road beneath her and the occasional sound of voices from the front of the car that she could not make into words. 7 minutes ago, she had been sitting in her apartment on a Monday evening. She had dinner. She was doing homework. She was with the man she loved. She did not know where the car was going. She did not know how far it was going. She did not know what would happen when it stopped. She did not know if the threat, the voice through the trunk, the language of it, the absolute absence of uncertainty in it, was a promise or a warning or both. She did not know the names of anyone who had been in her apartment. She did not know the name of the organization that had sent them. On Benvenue Avenue, the street was quiet again. The lights in the apartment on the 4th floor were still on. Inside, Stephen Weed was on the floor, bound, bleeding from the blows to his head. Sandra Matthews, the woman who had briefly opened the door, was on the phone with the police. Other neighbors were at their windows or at their doors, trying to understand what the screaming had been and why it had stopped. The car carrying Patricia Hearst moved through the streets of Berkeley and then into Oakland and kept going, and the city moved past in the darkness. The Symbionese Liberation Army had studied the Tupamaros. They had read the transcripts of interviews with Tupamaro leaders explaining the theory and practice of revolutionary kidnapping. They had watched State of Siege. They had made lists and conducted surveillance and stolen cars and modified a closet door so that it could not be opened from the inside. They had been planning this in one form or another since the name Patricia Campbell Hearst appeared on a list that police had found and not acted on. They had an action. What they did not have, what becomes apparent almost immediately when you look closely at what happened in the days and weeks that followed February 4th, was any clear idea of what came after the action. The communiques were ready. The demands were forming. The People's Jail, the closet in Daly City, was prepared. But the question of what you do with a 19-year-old woman once you have her, how you talk to her, what you tell her, what you need her to become, what you are willing to do to make her become it, that question had not been answered. They had been planning a kidnapping, someone prominent, for around 2 months. A symbol that would show the movement that the SLA were the vanguard radical leaders that should be followed, should be appeased, should be known. Kidnap someone. Use tactics learned from the Tupamaros. Get a lot of street cred. But then Bo and Osceola were arrested and the plan shifted. Still a kidnapping, but less symbolic, more strategic. They chose Patricia Hearst, the heiress to media conglomerate, because they thought they were getting a bargaining chip. They were getting something considerably more complicated than that. They just didn't know it yet. And here is where the story becomes something that 50+ years of cultural argument has not resolved and may never resolve. Because what happened next in that house in Daly City, in that closet, is one of the most genuinely contested and genuinely important questions in American criminal history. Not the legal question, though that was contested too. The human question, the psychological question, the question that sits underneath every argument about Patricia Hearst and refuses to be settled by verdicts or pardons or memoirs or documentaries. What does it actually do to a person? 59 days in a closet, darkness, isolation, voices of strangers from outside the door, fear that is not theoretical but physical and constant, the documented, deliberately constructed conditions of coercive persuasion applied to a 19-year-old woman who went in one person and came out someone different. We have the photographs, we have the tapes, we have the bank footage. We have our own account given under circumstances that were themselves contested. We do not have an answer. We have a question that the next 6 episodes are going to sit inside, turning it over, examining it from every angle available, and arriving, honestly, without the false comfort of certainty, at what I hope will be the most straightforward account of what happened and what it means that this series can provide.
Thank you for listening to House on Fire, Patty Hearst, the SLA, and the Seduction of Revolution. This is H. Allegra Lansing. This is a story about a country at war with itself, and about what happens when a generation's fury collapses into the worst possible reaction. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not fail because the injustice they saw wasn't real. They failed because they chose violence, and violence is the one form of resistance that entrenched power already knows how to defeat. It has been defeating it for centuries. Everyone swept up in the movement would pay a cost beyond measure, even an heiress to the nation's most powerful media empire. On the next episode of House on Fire, Patricia Hearst is in the trunk of a car, in her robe, with nothing on her feet, her hands bound, and a blanket over her head. What happens after the car stops is one of the most documented and most contested psychological transformation stories in American history. A closet with a door that locks from the outside. Voices that become the only voices she hears. The terror of that first night will not last forever. What replaces it, slowly, deliberately, through weeks of isolation and lectures and carefully controlled human contact, is something far more complicated than a kidnapping, an education, or an indoctrination. This webcast is based on historical records, contemporary reporting, and archival research. All writing and most narration by yours truly. Theme music is Red Shift by The Grey Room with Density and Time.